Welcome to the channel, everyone. This video is going to be part 2 on this Weld Thru primer. Now, I haven't taken apart this panel yet. I've been thinking about how I want to take this apart without doing any more damage. I really didn't want to grind into the welds because I don't want to destroy any of the coatings that are going to be between these two panels. I wanted to separate them as clean as possible. So I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to center punch these plug welds, put an 1/8 inch pilot hole through there, and then I'm going to start with a 5/16 bit through all of them. From there I'm going to move up. If they don't release, I'll probably go up in 30-second increments and do each one individually until it'll just separate. Work down the line. I just want to pull it apart nice and clean. Like I said, I don't want to pry in there. I don't want to chisel or anything. I don't want to remove any of the coatings that are in there. So before I take these panels apart, I want to talk about some other issues with this. I'm reading through the comments, and the people that have issues with the Weld Thru primer, so that's what they've been doing, is just cleaning it off and welding through it, solve that problem. But I had a pretty good comment from a guy named Christopher, and he said they should actually call it around the weld primer. And he says, you know, it causes porosity, that's why it sizzles and pops, and you're probably going to get a failed weld. I got to be thinking about that. And maybe that's why Chrysler didn't recommend Weld Thru primer, because the welds were failing. And years ago at an I-car class, they talked about make sure you remove the E-coat, because the fumes, the gases from that burning gets into shielding gas and it's going to affect your weld. So what I did, I put another call in the sim, and I talked to Dave again, and I asked him, I said, when you guys have tested this stuff, your Weld Thru primer, and they've done destructive tests on the weld, I said, did you compare it to a spot weld with no primer versus a spot weld with the Weld Thru primer in there? And he said nobody's ever asked him that question. He wasn't sure the answer, so he'd have to check. And I told him, you know, some of the comments I got from my viewers, and I mentioned that somebody said they should call it around the weld primer. He actually liked that. He thought that was pretty good. He said he'd have to check with their testing department and see what he could find. He talked to somebody shortly after, and he said that they did test their welds once they used the Weld Thru primer. They did a destructive test, bare metal and destructive test with the primer, and they also did this when they tested all these other brands. He said probably 5 or 6 other brands. They tested everybody's the same. And he said their equipment they have, a spot weld will break at between 1,400 and 1,700 pounds of pressure. He said once they used the Weld Thru coating, there really wasn't any appreciable difference. He said not enough to think, you know, to sway their thinking one way or another. So they're pretty confident that the weld, it's not going to fail. And you know, this stuff's been around for decades, and I think if there was an issue, people were having problems, it would have been addressed by now, but everybody's recommending to use it. Okay, so right now I'm going to start drilling on these and get it taken apart. Now, this weld right here had Weld Thru primer, and I didn't scrape it off. Once I started drilling on my center punch mark, the bit walked over, and it did have a big pinhole that was buried underneath there. So yeah, it does cause porosity if it's not removed. So I repunched it over a little bit more, try and get away from that hole. Okay, nothing coming loose yet. I'm going to use a 21/64. Still nothing coming loose, so I'm going to switch to 11/32. Okay, still tight. What I'm going to do, I'm going to take my belt sander, get rid of all these burrs on here, the edges of the weld, taper them a little bit. Actually, those things are wanting to catch on the drill bit, so I'll smooth those out. All right, I'm up to a 23/64. So something should be coming loose pretty soon. All right, I'm going to work my way around and pry this loose. What I don't want to do is get anything right next to the weld. I want to see if that Weld Thru primer is up against the welds here. Okay, before I take this off and take a look at it, another question I had for David Sim. I said, when I take this apart, am I physically going to be able to see that Weld Thru primer melted around the welds with the naked eye, or do I need a Hubble telescope? He said you should be able to see it. It'd be real close to the weld. It's not going to be burned back 1/4 of an inch. It should be right up around there. So let's take a look and see what we got. Okay, first off is the bare metal. And there's really not much to talk about there because there was no coatings. Here's the Weld Thru primer, and it wasn't scratched off. And it's a little hard to make out, but you could see like a heat effect zone here. I don't know if this is Weld Thru primer that's been melted, but the burn back area isn't that big. You get about, most of it's an average of 1/8 of an inch away from it, and the primer looks pretty much like it was when I put it on. This one's a little bit oblong shape there. There's a self-etching primer, and you can see how this is burned way back around these two. Now here's the Weld Thru primer that I scraped off, and it doesn't look much different than where I just burned right through it. Same thing, it's a little bit oblong. And I can also see my weld. It's hard telling where the exact center is, so I center punched off just a little bit. You can see the burr on both sides here, and the heat effect zone is around there. So that's pretty much, looks about the same. Actually, it kind of looks like it's burned back a little bit more where the Weld Thru primer hasn't been scraped off. And that could be because it takes a little bit longer to get your weld going. Maybe it's subjected to a little more heat or a little longer time of heat. So, but it's fairly close. And these are the E-coat here. This one was burning right through the E-coat. This was removed. I don't see any difference. But if you look at this heat effect zone where that E-coat is melted, that's a big area where you don't have any protection. But the Weld Thru primer looks like it does pretty much what it's supposed to do. Now, like I said, I can't really tell if this is melted around here, but it's not burned away. Let me do something else here. I'm going to say if these were plug welds, say on a flange like a rocker panel, and here's the bottom edge pinch weld of that rocker panel, most of our heat effect zones are going to stay away from that edge. Where here, without any protection, that's burning through, so moisture coming in the bottom side got an easy access to get around that weld. It seems to work like they say. Once again, there's just strictly bare metal. That was the Weld Thru primer that I didn't scrape anything off of. That was etch prime, and it did burn quite a bit out of it. There's where I scraped the Weld Thru primer out. Looks like it held up good. And both of these, burning through the E-coat and scratching off the E-coat, really not much difference there. All right, my final thoughts on this Weld Thru primer is it should be used. If you do everything right, don't put it on too heavy, clean it up in the welds, and then get a proper weld, it's gonna work good for you. I'm convinced. I don't see any issue with it. Here's the bottom line. My whole career has been in the collision industry. Never was in a restoration shop or anything like that. Always collision. And if you remember, about 10, 15 years ago, these insurance companies started coming around to the shops and telling them, if you're gonna be on a preferred list of body shops and you're part of our DRP program, you have to give a lifetime warranty on your repairs. And at the time, most of the manufacturers only given a 2 or 3 year warranty, and now here we have to give a lifetime on the repair. And it wasn't that big of an issue. About the only issue you'd ever see would be either corrosion problem or something with paint. Either a paint fail, a peel. It only takes a few minutes to use the Weld Thru primer, use it correctly. If you're using seam sealer, using epoxies, use everything that's out there that's available. And if you do have a problem at that point and you did everything right, then you can go to your supply manufacturer and say, hey, we used all your products, we got an issue, you got somebody to look into and see what's going on. But when you don't use any of these coatings, you don't use caulking, you don't use epoxy, and it comes back with issues, you've only got yourself to blame. So this here is just kind of covering yourself. May not be 100%, but it's better than 0%. So anyway, if you like this video, let me know, give me a thumbs up, leave some comments, tell me what you think of all this. Maybe you think I'm all wrong, maybe you don't like my opinions, maybe you got a different opinion on it, but let me know. So anyway, thanks for watching.